This is the second presentation in a series on the implementation of the new liability management framework introduced by the government in July of 2020. We will focus on the holistic lifecycle approach that will be used in the oil and gas sector, which is supported by the Licensee Capability Assessment, the LCA. The presentation will provide a quick overview of why the new framework was needed, as well as touch upon the new components. We will go a little deeper into the elements of the LCA, which is a factor in the holistic licensee assessment, and would finish off with the next steps. Current liability programs are not holistic. There are two significant challenges we have faced in previous years with respect to liability management. First, there has been insufficient closure work done to manage the growth of liability in the province, partially due to the fact that there was no regulatory requirements for timing of closure work. Second, the Licensee Liability Rating Program, which uses the LMR, the Liability Management Rating, is a ratio which only uses two components, the licensee's deemed assets or redeemed liability. This does not provide a full picture of the licensee's capability or its overall performance, including end-of-life obligations, which are the costs associated with closure work, known as liability. The Government of Alberta heard these challenges in the 2017 Liability Management Review, where Indigenous and stakeholder groups were invited to provide feedback. Addressing some of these challenges, the Government of Alberta announced liability policy direction through a new liability management framework on July 30th, 2020. A reminder of what has occurred to date. The GOA has directed the AER to create new liability management programs based on the new policy announced. The new policy introduces 5 components and encompasses the full life cycle of energy development. The first, foundational piece of the holistic assessment is the LCA. This assessment applies business intelligence that can be leveraged for decision-making across the life cycle. Second, the licensee special action, which AER is calling the Licensee Management Program, uses holistic assessment results to apply appropriate regulatory interventions and actions from education to compliance. These actions encourage licensees to manage and address the regulatory and liability obligations throughout the life cycle. Third, the Inventory Reduction Program, which includes closure targets for licensees, and an opt-in mechanism for landowners to nominate sites for closure. Fourth, the legacy and post-closure, which will address the policy gaps of legacy sites and post-closure issues that do not fall within the mandate of the OWA. Finally, the fifth, expanding the OWA mandate, which allows the OWA to have greater authority over assets and to work with working interest participants to address timely closure. We are leveraging AER and industry data to build business intelligence to enable a holistic assessment to evaluate an oil and gas licensee's capability and risks across the life cycle. The Licensee Capability Assessment uses 3 elements. The first, referred to as the Capability and Liability Assessment, looks at the licensee's financial and liability risk. Second, it looks at the licensee's sustainability and the relative quality of its mineral and surface assets compared to its peers. The third element of the LCA, performance, is a peer relative assessment of the licensee's overall performance using operational, closure, and administrative factors. These 3 elements combine to assess the licensee's capabilities and risk more comprehensively than the single LMR calculation in use today. Back to the first element. The capability and liability risk represents the probability and consequence of a typical risk assessment. The first component, the financial health, reviews a company's financial statements to gain insight into its overall financial health and level of distress. The second component of this element is the magnitude of liability, which represents the relative level of monetary consequence should a company not be able to meet its regulatory and liability obligations. To better understand a licensee's financial capability, the LCA's financial assessment uses common, accepted, and understood financial industry parameters found in all financial statements. These financial ratios measure a company's profitability over time, their ability to access cash, and the impact their level of debt has on their ongoing operations. This information provides an evaluation of a company's financial capability to address the regulatory and liability obligations. Licensees are grouped in accordance with their relative level of assessed financial risk as either being high, medium, or low. The magnitude of liability represents the monetary consequence should a company not be able to meet their regulatory and liability obligations. This is an estimate of the financial risk that could be transferred to the OWA and that would burden the remaining producing companies. Each licensee's relative total liabilities are estimated and grouped into 3 levels of risk: high, medium, and low. The thresholds were determined with the low magnitude threshold representing approximately 80% of the licensees. This only makes up 10% of the total liabilities. The bulk of the liability is held by the remaining 20% of licensees and the medium and high magnitude thresholds. Combining a licensee's financial and liability assessments, licensees are grouped into a risk matrix. This grouping is an important feature in the licensee's profile in that it identifies their financial capability of the licensee to manage their current liabilities. The risk matrix helps us identify where in the scale of probability and consequence a licensee fits relative to other licensees. The second element of LCA evaluates a licensee's sustainability. This is the remaining lifespan of mineral resources and infrastructure and the extent to which existing operations may fund current and future liabilities. Some examples of the parameters included in this assessment are the production decline rate and inactive ratios. Third element of the LCA evaluates a licensee's performance in 3 key areas. The first, closure performance, looks at the rate of closure activity and spending, as well as the inactive liability growth. The second component looks at operational performance, such as the level of care and control that a licensee maintains their operating wells, facilities, and pipelines. If these assets are effectively maintained and regulatory requirements met while in operation, they will generally reduce the liability risk when they need to be closed. Some of their parameters include Directive 13 well suspension, well and facility releases and spills, and pipeline incidents. The final component, administrative performance, focuses on compliance to regulatory requirements, including management of debts, fees, and levies. Now we need to cover the concept of peer groups as it is applied to sustainability and performance. Peer groups include all licensees, be they producers or non-producers. First, licensees are grouped by their primary business activity. A licensee is determined to be pipeline, midstream, or waste management company if more than 50% of its estimated liabilities are related to pipelines, facilities, or waste management, respectively. Producers are active producing companies, while dormant companies are still legal active entities that have associated liabilities but no production. Producer peer groups are further defined by the size of the company based on production levels and their primary production or commodity type. We will be using these peer groups when we assess both sustainability and performance of a licensee. In order to evaluate licensees relative to the peers, we rank them. Tier 1 is the group of top quartile performers, with Tier 3 being the bottom quartile relative to the peers. Tier 2 is the middle 50%. Using this holistic licensee assessment, we found that many licensees can share a common profile and cluster these licensees accordingly. Based on licensee profiles, we will identify and prioritize the AER's effort and regulatory interventions. The 2 priority areas of focus are on licensees and activities with the greatest impact on liability reduction and working with distressed licensees. This wraps up our presentation on the licensee capability assessment. Please stay tuned for further updates on the liability management framework implementation. There will be an upcoming presentation on the inventory reduction program, specifically focusing on the closure spend targets, publication of a new draft directive for public comment, and additional information on the AER website. Thank you for your interest in the Liability Management Framework, and please check back frequently to the AER website for new developments.